Ash Hollow was the kind of town that seemed to have been forgotten by time. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was surrounded by dense forests, their towering trees casting long, eerie shadows over the narrow, winding roads that led into the heart of the town. The population was small, just a few hundred people, most of whom had lived there their entire lives. Outsiders rarely ventured into Ash Hollow, and those who did often left with a sense of unease, as if the town itself were alive, watching them with unseen eyes. The town's history was steeped in mystery and folklore. The older residents spoke in hushed tones about the old times, a period long before any of them were born, when strange and terrible things were said to have happened in the woods surrounding Ash Hollow. There were stories of people vanishing without a trace, of ghostly figures seen wandering among the trees at night, and of a dark presence that was said to lurk deep within the forest, waiting for the unwary to venture too close. Most of the younger generation dismissed these stories as nothing more than superstitions, old wives' tales passed down through the years to keep children from straying too far into the woods. But there were those who believed, who knew, that there was something more to the stories, something darker and far more dangerous. One of those believers was a man named Samuel Reed. Sam had lived in Ash Hollow his entire life, and he had heard the stories from his grandparents, who had heard them from their grandparents before them. He had always felt a connection to the woods, a pull that drew him deeper into their shadows, despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. It was this connection that had led him to become the town's unofficial historian, collecting tales and legends from the older residents, compiling them into a journal that he kept hidden away in his small, cluttered home on the edge of the forest. Sam's obsession with the woods and their secrets had only grown stronger over the years, and he spent countless hours wandering among the trees, searching for answers to the questions that had haunted him since he was a child. One cool autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, Sam sat at his kitchen table, staring at the open journal in front of him. The pages were filled with notes, sketches, and transcriptions of the stories he had gathered over the years, but there was one entry that he kept returning to, a story that had been told to him by an old woman named Martha Jenkins, just a few weeks before she passed away. Martha had been one of the oldest residents of Ash Hollow, her family having lived in the town for generations. She had told Sam about a place deep within the woods, a place that was known only to a few, where the trees grew so thick and tall that the sunlight never reached the forest floor. It was a place of darkness, she had said, where the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers of the dead could be heard on the wind. Martha had called it the Witch's Hollow. According to her story, the hollow had been the site of a great tragedy many years ago, when a woman accused of witchcraft had been hunted down by the townspeople and hanged from a great oak tree that stood in the center of the clearing. The woman's name had been Sarah Blackwood, and she had been a healer, known for her knowledge of herbs and potions. But when a mysterious illness swept through the town, killing dozens, the people had turned on her, blaming her for the deaths. In her final moments, as the noose tightened around her neck, Sarah had cursed the town, vowing that her spirit would remain in the hollow, and that she would have her revenge on those who had wronged her. The townspeople, driven by fear and desperation, had ignored her words, but in the years that followed, strange and terrible things had begun to happen. People who ventured too deep into the woods began to disappear, their bodies never found. Those who did return spoke of hearing strange whispers in the trees, of feeling eyes watching them from the shadows. Some claimed to have seen a ghostly figure in the hollow, a woman with long dark hair and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Sam had always been skeptical of ghost stories, but there was something about Martha's tale that had stuck with him, a nagging feeling that there was more to it than just superstition. He had tried to find the hollow, spending hours searching the woods, but it was as if the place didn't want to be found. The deeper he went, the more the trees seemed to close in around him, the paths twisting and turning until he was hopelessly lost. But tonight, as he stared at the pages of his journal, a decision formed in his mind. He would go back into the woods one last time, and he wouldn't return until he had found the Witch's Hollow. The next morning, Sam rose before dawn, packing a small bag with supplies. food, water, a flashlight, a compass, and a map of the area, though he knew it wouldn't be much help in the uncharted depths of the forest. He also brought his journal, tucking it into his coat pocket, along with a pencil to record anything he might find. As he stepped out of his house, the air was cool and crisp, the first light of dawn just beginning to creep over the horizon. The town was still asleep, the streets empty and silent, and Sam felt a sense of unease settle over him as he made his way to the edge of the woods. He hesitated for a moment at the tree line, looking back at the town, at the familiar streets and houses where he had spent his entire life. But the pull of the forest was too strong, and with a deep breath, he stepped into the shadows of the trees. The woods were quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of a bird in the branches above. The trees towered over him, their thick trunks and gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. As he walked, Sam kept his eyes and ears open, searching for any sign of the hollow. He had a vague sense of direction, based on the stories he had heard, but the deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing denser and more twisted, their roots snaking across the ground like the fingers of some great ancient beast. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, though its light barely penetrated the thick canopy above. Sam paused to eat a quick lunch, sitting on a fallen log and glancing nervously around him. The woods were still, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. After eating, Sam continued on his way, pushing deeper into the forest. The ground grew uneven and treacherous, the underbrush thick and tangled, making progress slow and difficult. Several times he had to stop and backtrack, the paths twisting and turning in ways that made no sense, as if the forest were deliberately trying to confuse him. But he pressed on, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. He had to find the hollow, had to know if the stories were true. As the afternoon wore on, the light began to fade, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. Sam knew he should turn back, should find a place to set up camp before darkness fell, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. There was something in the air, a tension that crackled just beneath the surface, and he felt as if he were on the verge of discovering something important, something that had been hidden for a long time. It was just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees that he saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance, deep within the forest. It was barely visible, a pale glow that seemed to pulse in the darkness, and Sam felt his heart skip a beat. He quickened his pace, pushing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that scratched at his face and hands. The light grew brighter as he drew closer, and he could see now that it was coming from a small clearing, the trees thinning out to reveal a patch of open ground. Sam stepped into the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The light was coming from a single source, a large ancient oak tree that stood in the center of the clearing, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The tree's bark was blackened and cracked, as if it had been burned in some great fire, and at its base a circle of stones had been arranged, their surfaces worn smooth by time. This was the Witch's Hollow. As Sam approached the tree, he could feel a cold wind blowing through the clearing, the air thick with the scent of decay. The light, which he had seen from a distance, seemed to be emanating from the tree itself, a faint, otherworldly glow that pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. He reached out to touch the tree's bark, but as his fingers brushed the rough surface, a sharp pain shot through his hand, and he yanked it back, hissing in pain. His palm was bleeding, a thin line of red running down his wrist, and he stared at it in shock, unsure of what had just happened. Before he could react, a voice whispered in his ear, soft and chilling, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. "You shouldn't have come here." Sam spun around, his heart pounding, but there was no one there, only the dark, silent trees that surrounded the clearing. He felt a wave of fear wash over him, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Leave this place, now!" Sam's legs were shaking, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the tree. There was something about it, something that held him in place, as if the tree itself were alive, watching him with unseen eyes. And then, as he stood there, paralyzed by fear, he heard the whispers. They started out faint, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second, until the air was filled with the sound of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, their words indistinguishable, a cacophony of sound that filled his mind, drowning out all thought. Sam clapped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was no use. The voices were inside his head, echoing in his skull, driving him to the brink of madness. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground, the impact jarring him back to reality. The whispers faded, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of his stomach. He had to get out of here, now. Sam scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for a way out. But the trees seemed to have closed in around him, their branches intertwining to form a solid wall of wood and leaves. He was trapped. Panic surged through him, and he ran toward the edge of the clearing, but no matter how fast he ran, the trees remained just out of reach, the darkness closing in around him. And then, just as he thought he would be lost forever, the trees parted, and he burst out of the clearing, back into the forest. He didn't stop running, didn't look back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the trees, the branches tearing at his clothes, the underbrush tripping him up at every turn. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stumbled out of the woods and onto the road that led back to Ash Hollow. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent behind him, the clearing lost in the darkness, but he could still hear the whispers echoing in his mind, a reminder of the horror he had just escaped. But as he sat there gasping for breath, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He had left his journal behind, in the Witch's Hollow. Sam spent the next few days in a state of shock, unable to focus on anything but the events that had transpired in the woods. He kept to himself, barely leaving his house, his thoughts consumed by the memory of the whispers, of the tree, and of the journal he had left behind. The journal had been more than just a collection of stories. It had been his life's work, the culmination of years of research and obsession. And now it was gone, lost in the hollow, along with whatever secrets it might have contained. The thought gnawed at him, driving him to the brink of madness. He knew he should be relieved to have escaped the forest with his life, but all he could think about was the journal and the need to go back, to retrieve it, no matter the cost. It was this need, this overwhelming compulsion, that finally drove him to make the decision that would seal his fate. He would return to the Witch's Hollow. The decision wasn't made lightly. He knew the risks, knew that he might not survive another encounter with whatever dark force lurked in the hollow. But the pull was too strong, the need too great, and he found himself unable to resist. He spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, and mapping out a route that would take him back to the clearing. He knew he couldn't rely on the same path he had taken before. The forest was too unpredictable, too dangerous. Instead, he would follow a more direct route, using landmarks he had noted during his previous visit to guide him. The night before he was set to leave, Sam lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what awaited him in the woods. He knew he was walking into danger, knew that he might not return, but the fear was overshadowed by a grim determination, a resolve that had hardened in the days since his first encounter with the Hollow. He would go back, and this time he would be ready. The next morning, just before dawn, Sam set out once again, his bag packed with supplies and a new journal tucked into his coat pocket. He followed the road out of town, the sky just beginning to lighten as he reached the edge of the forest. He hesitated for a moment, looking back at the town, at the safety and comfort it offered. But there was no turning back now, and with a deep breath, he stepped into the woods. The forest was just as he remembered it, dark, silent, and foreboding. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled and twisted, blocking out the light and casting the forest floor in deep shadows. But Sam pressed on, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, his mind focused on the task at hand. He moved quickly, navigating the uneven terrain with a practiced ease, his senses heightened by the knowledge of what lay ahead. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, the scent of decay growing stronger, and he knew he was getting close. The trees began to thin out, the underbrush growing thicker, until finally he stepped into the clearing. The clearing was just as he had left it, the great oak tree standing in the center, its branches reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. The light, that eerie, otherworldly glow, still pulsed from the tree, casting the clearing in an unnatural light. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the tree, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the journal. But the ground was bare, the stones at the base of the tree undisturbed. And then he saw it, a small, black book lying in the shadows at the base of the tree, just out of reach. His journal. Sam's breath caught in his throat, a mixture of relief and fear washing over him. He had found it, had found the journal that had consumed his thoughts for days. But as he reached out to grab it, the whispers began. They started out faint, just as they had before, but they grew louder with each passing second, filling the air with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, a torrent of sound that threatened to overwhelm him. Sam froze, his hand hovering over the journal, his mind racing. He could feel the presence in the hollow, could feel it watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He knew he had to act quickly before the voices drove him mad. With a sudden burst of courage, he lunged forward, grabbing the journal and yanking it out of the shadows. The voices exploded in his mind, a deafening roar that sent him reeling backward, clutching the journal to his chest. The air grew cold, the light from the tree pulsing in time with the pounding of his heart. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, the voices stopped. Sam stood there, panting, his heart racing, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The clearing was silent, the light from the tree fading, leaving him in darkness. He had done it. He had retrieved the journal. But as he turned to leave, to make his way back to the safety of the town, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart skipping a beat. But there was no one there, only the dark, silent trees that surrounded the clearing. And then he heard the voice, clear and cold, echoing in the darkness. "You cannot leave." Sam's blood ran cold, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, no one. And then the trees began to move. The branches twisted and writhed, their bark cracking and splitting, as if the trees themselves were coming to life. The roots snaked across the ground, forming a barrier that blocked his path, trapping him in the hollow. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "You cannot leave." Sam backed away, his heart pounding, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. The trees closed in around him, the branches reaching out, their twisted fingers grasping for him. He was trapped. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the cold wind whipping through the clearing, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. Sam knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was not going to make it out of the hollow alive. The presence in the clearing was too strong, too powerful, and he had trespassed too far into its domain. But he couldn't give up. He couldn't let the forest claim him. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Sam turned and ran, the roots and branches tearing at his clothes, the voices in his mind driving him to the brink of madness. He ran through the forest, the trees closing in around him, the darkness swallowing him whole. He could feel the presence behind him, could feel it gaining on him, its cold breath on the back of his neck. But he didn't stop, didn't look back, his eyes fixed on the path ahead, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. And then, just as he thought he would be lost forever, the trees parted, and he burst out of the woods and onto the road that led back to Ash Hollow. He collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The forest was silent behind him, the clearing lost in the darkness, but he could still hear the whispers echoing in his mind, a reminder of the horror he had just escaped. But as he sat there, gasping for breath, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The journal was gone. Sam returned to Ash Hollow, a changed man. The experience in the Witch's Hollow had left him shaken, his mind haunted by the memories of the whispers, of the presence in the clearing, and of the journal he had lost. He tried to return to his old life, to forget what had happened in the woods, but the memories refused to fade. They lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked in the forest, just beyond the town's borders. The people of Ash Hollow noticed the change in him. He had always been a quiet man, but now he was distant, withdrawn, his eyes hollow and haunted. He rarely left his house, spending his days poring over old books and manuscripts, searching for answers to the questions that still plagued him. But no matter how hard he searched, he could find no explanation for what he had experienced in the hollow. The nights were the worst. The whispers, which had faded in the days following his return, grew louder as the sun set, filling his mind with the same cacophony of voices that had driven him from the hollow. They whispered to him in the darkness, taunting him, reminding him of the knowledge he had sought, and the price he had paid. He couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the voices, no matter how hard he tried. The days and nights blurred together, a constant, unrelenting torment that drove him to the brink of madness. And then, one night, as he sat alone in his darkened house, the voices spoke to him. They were clear this time, their words distinct, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. Sam felt a cold shiver run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the voices were not just in his mind. They were real as the forest, as real as the presence that had nearly claimed him. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, just before dawn, Sam set out for the woods once again. This time, he brought nothing with him, no supplies, no journal, no map. He didn't need them. The path was clear in his mind, etched into his memory by the voices that had haunted him for so long. The forest was silent as he entered, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching as he made his way deeper into the woods. The air was cold, the scent of decay growing stronger with each step he took, but he didn't stop, didn't hesitate. He knew where he was going. It wasn't long before he reached the clearing. The great oak tree stood in the center, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky, the faint, otherworldly glow pulsing from its bark. The stones at its base were undisturbed, the ground bare, as if nothing had changed since his last visit. Sam stepped into the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. The voices were silent now, the air thick with tension, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to make a move. He approached the tree, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with a grim resolve. He had come this far, had survived the horrors of the hollow, and now it was time to face whatever awaited him. As he reached out to touch the tree, the whispers returned, a low murmur that filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. But this time, he didn't pull away. He pressed his hand against the rough bark, feeling the cold, pulsing energy that emanated from the tree. And then the voices stopped. The clearing was silent, the air still, as if time itself had frozen. Sam stood there, his hand on the tree, waiting, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. And then he heard it, a voice clear and cold, echoing in the darkness. "You have returned." Sam's blood ran cold, his eyes darting around the clearing, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, no one. And then the tree began to move. The bark split and cracked, the branches twisting and writhing, as if the tree were coming to life. The stones at its base trembled, the ground beneath them shifting and breaking apart. And then, from the center of the tree, a figure emerged. It was a woman, her form pale and ghostly, her hair long and dark, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. She stepped out of the tree, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were waking from a long sleep. Sam stared in shock, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. He knew who she was, knew her name, though he had never seen her before. Sarah Blackwood, the witch. She stepped toward him, her eyes fixed on his, a cold smile on her lips. "You sought knowledge," she said, her voice soft and chilling, "and you have found it." Sam couldn't move, couldn't speak, his mind frozen with fear. "You have trespassed in my domain," she continued, her voice growing colder, harsher. "And now you will pay the price." The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the cold wind whipping through the clearing, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. Sam felt a cold hand on his shoulder, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he was not going to leave the hollow alive. The last thing he heard was the sound of the whispers, growing louder, filling his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. And then, darkness, The people of Ash Hollow spoke in hushed tones about Samuel Reed, the man who had disappeared into the woods and never returned. They told stories of his obsession with the Witch's Hollow, of the journal he had kept, filled with stories and legends of the dark history of the town. Some said he had gone mad, driven to the brink by the whispers in the woods. Others claimed he had been taken by the witch, her spirit still lingering in the hollow, waiting for those who dared to trespass in her domain. The older residents, those who remembered the stories of the old times, warned their children to stay away from the woods, to never venture too deep into the forest, for fear of what might be waiting for them in the darkness. And so, the legend of Ash Hollow grew, passed down from generation to generation. A story of a man who had sought knowledge and paid the ultimate price. But there were those who still ventured into the woods, drawn by the stories, by the mystery, by the allure of the unknown. And some said that on quiet nights, when the wind was still, you could hear the whispers echoing through the trees, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the town's borders. And those who heard the whispers knew, with a cold certainty, that the Witch's Hollow was not just a story, not just a legend. It was real, and it was waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Please